Week after week, Ukraine has been hitting Russia where it hurts. We don't mean causing casualties by the thousands on the battlefield, though that is certainly happening. We also don't mean that Ukraine is destroying armor and air defenses in enormous numbers, though that is happening too. We're talking about Ukraine's true masterstroke, unrelenting strikes against Russia's oil refineries. Those strikes have paid off, cutting Russia's refining capacity so substantially that Vladimir Putin is getting desperate. Russia's president has no other option. Putin has gone crawling to Belarus for help as Ukraine took everything from Russia. And when we say everything, we really mean it. On October 1, the Kyiv Post published an article in which it pointed out that Ukraine's strikes against Russia's oil refineries have now taken a staggering 38% of Russia's refining capacity. That's a third of Russia's refining gone. Vanished into thin air, at least until Russia can manage to fix the damage that Ukraine is causing. That's easier said than done. Ukraine has been hitting Russia's refineries since 2024, though it didn't cause this sheer scale of problems initially. The difference now is that Ukraine has evolved its strategy. It doesn't just hit a refinery in isolation and then leave it until Russia repairs it. Ukraine strikes a refinery. Then it strikes again and again, giving Russia no chance to get the facility up and running again. Repairs happen slowly. But by the time they're done, something else in the refinery has been destroyed and requires fixing. Plus, the components needed for those repairs are in short supply as a result of Western sanctions. And it's thanks to this combination of sanctions and Ukraine's strategy that Russia now finds itself having lost 38% of its refining capacity, and more than likely, will lose even more as the Ukraine war drags on. The Kyiv Post provides the numbers, courtesy of the market intelligence agency Sila. Ukraine's strikes have managed to take 338,000 tons of Russian oil refining per day completely offline. That has led to Russia's collective output of gasoline dropping by about 1 million tons, which is wreaking havoc on the country's domestic market. Right now, the Kyiv Post reports Russia is 20% short of its domestic gasoline market's demand, which is causing major problems for Putin's efforts to keep his people under control. After all, Putin lies and manipulates to maintain that control. He withholds information. He claims that Russia is doing far better than it is against Ukraine, and that his great enemy is on the verge of capitulating. It gets a lot more difficult to make those sorts of claims when your citizens are queuing for hours just for a chance to get their hands on gasoline that used to flow freely. And with each passing day, Russia's gasoline crisis seems to deepen. Writing for Forbes on September 29, David Hambling covered the crisis in detail. He says that a shortage that started with some of Russia's outlying, and in Putin's mind, less important regions has worsened to the point where gasoline shortages are now being felt across the country. Rising prices, long queues, rationing, and in some cases, pumps running dry are becoming part of life in Russia. Hambling writes, showcasing how Ukraine has created a new normal for the everyday Russian that proves every word Putin says about how the war is going is a lie. Prices are a particular problem. Hambling says that buyers at the pumps are now paying up to $4.52 per gallon of gasoline in some regions, which is veering uncomfortably close to double Russia's officially claimed average price of $2.66. We see the deception in action. Russia claims one price, knowing that its people are paying far more. Euromaidan Press, in an October 1 report, adds that price increases have been massive since the beginning of 2025. Between January and today, wholesale gasoline prices have jumped by more than 40%, with AI-92 grade gasoline selling at $880 per ton, while a ton of AI-95 retails for $850. Of course, those higher prices are being passed on to the consumer, assuming gas stations are even able to get their hands on increasingly expensive gasoline. It's in his desperate search for a solution to these major problems that Putin has gone crawling to Belarus, but we'll get to that a little later in the video. Coming back to the problems at the pumps, Euromaidan Press adds that shortages are so bad that restrictions are in place in several regions. Over 20 of those regions face shortages, the outlet claims. Crimea, which Russia occupied, has placed a limit of 30 liters or about 6.5 gallons per purchase per customer. Other regions have even tighter restrictions, with some going as low as 10 liters, that's just over 2.5 gallons. For context, an average sedan requires between 12 and 16 gallons for a full tank, meaning the best the average Russian can hope for in some of these affected regions is half a tank before they're moved along. Hambling adds to this. He says that some of Russia's regional chains have restricted not just how much gasoline customers can buy, but also which customers can buy in the first place. One regional chain is now reportedly only selling to commercial customers with fleet fuel cards, while another flipped the idea and is no longer selling to customers with fuel cards, Hambling says. These aren't moves made by companies that are in good health. This is panic. It's gasoline chains doing whatever they can think of to stretch their dwindling supplies of their chief product, all as Ukraine's strikes cause further restrictions that will hit these companies harder in the future. Gas station closures are becoming increasingly common. Parents can't even pick their children up from school in some regions. And despite Russia's leadership doing its best to convince the public that nothing is untoward, going as far as to ban footage of drone strikes on refineries from being shared, Putin has to face the reality of Russia's situation. These shortages tell Russia's people that bad things are happening. One of the world's most oil-rich nations is running out of gasoline, and that can only be happening for one reason: Ukraine is destroying Russia's refineries. In an October 1 report, the Moscow Times puts it bluntly: Putin can't hide Russia's gasoline crisis, the headline blares. It points out that many of the head honchos in Russia's fuel industry are trying to frame what is happening as a temporary period of shortage that will be resolved soon. But it is. The Moscow Times says these shortages aren't a wartime inconvenience. They're a warning flare, a massive red flag that is showing the average Russian that massive cracks are forming in the wartime economy Putin has created to sustain a special military operation that has lasted years when it was supposed to be over in days. Meanwhile, Russia is sinking deeper into recession. VEB. The state-owned development bank that bankrolls major government projects now forecasts GDP contracting by 0.6% for 2 straight quarters, a textbook technical recession, the Moscow Times reports. Think about what that means in the context of the gasoline price increases we mentioned earlier. A contracting economy means less money to go around for a general public that is already being squeezed off every last ruble when buying food and now gasoline. Something has to give, and it may just end up being Putin's grasp on leadership. Of course, Putin doesn't want to relinquish the presidency, and in his desperation he has gone crawling to a nation that for so long has appeared to serve as a puppet state for Russia: Belarus. Belarus and Russia have maintained a steady, though at times contentious, relationship when it comes to energy. It was only in 2010 that Russia was cutting Belarus off from gas supplies due to debts, so the relationship between the two nations has never been quite as rosy as it would seem, given Belarus's role in facilitating Putin's Ukraine invasion. However, with Russia struggling, Belarus has gone from being a nation that Putin can influence to one that he's turning to in order to rescue Russia. There's a problem with this approach. Belarus may be willing to help Russia, but it may not be able. Euromaidan Press reports that September 30 saw the Eurasian Economic Commission, or EEC, of which Russia and Belarus are members, temporarily suspend import duties on all fuel. This is obviously a move designed to help Russia in its moment of need, as it clears the way for Russia to start buying refined oil products in droves from Belarus without having to pay any form of import tax. And Russia needs that ability. Euromaidan Press says Ukraine's refinery strikes have put Russia in a position where it will need 9 months to resolve its supposedly temporary fuel crisis. That assumes that Ukraine doesn't take out any more of Russia's refining capacity, which is a pretty big assumption to make given how well this strategy has worked for Ukraine. Back to the EEC's suspension, that has put Russia in the position where it has banned fuel exports from other nations while allowing it to prepare for mass imports of fuel from its much smaller neighbors. It's as one-sided as an agreement can be, and it's to Belarus that Putin came calling. Initially, Belarus wasn't especially receptive. When import taxes were in place, Russia was offering Belarus less than $1,000 per ton of gasoline. Belarus could get between $1,300 and $1,900 per ton on the international market, so it wasn't willing to sell anywhere near what Putin wanted or needed to deal with Russia's refined oil crisis. In August, Euromaidan Press says, Belarus even announced that it would restrict its fuel supplies to Russia. Except, it didn't actually seem to do that. Between July and September, Belarus has sold 36% more petroleum products to Russia via the St. Petersburg exchange than it did during the same period in 2024. That amounts to 97,000 tons of petroleum products. Of those products, the two most important to Russia are gasoline and diesel. Sales of both by Belarus to Russia skyrocketed in September. Belarus sold 168% more gasoline to Russia in September than it did in August, with diesel sales increasing by a small, though still impressive, 83%. So all signs now point to Belarus being on board with selling gasoline and diesel to help Russia. Putin's begging and suspension of import tariffs must have worked. However, we said earlier that Belarus may be willing to sell more petroleum products to Russia, but it may not be able. The reason is that Belarus relies heavily on its own refineries to ensure it meets its own domestic demand for gasoline. Euromaidan Press outlines why this is such a problem. Belarusian refineries have an annual production capacity of only 3-4 million tons of gasoline, with 2 million tons consumed domestically, while Russia consumes 3 million tons of gasoline in 1 month alone, the outlet says. You likely see the problem. Anywhere between half and 2/3 of Belarus's gasoline production is already tied up in its domestic market. That leaves between 1 and 2 million tons of gasoline left over for the entire year. Those numbers are fine for a small nation when it isn't under pressure to produce more. Belarus handles its own gasoline needs and has a surplus to sell to boost its economy. However, that annual surplus isn't even enough to cover a single month of Russia's gasoline consumption, especially at a time when Russia is using more gasoline than ever before due to the Ukraine war. Putin is begging for scraps, and though Belarus is willing to drop those scraps from the table, they're nowhere near enough to sustain Russia's massive gasoline needs. Belarus does have another idea for how it could help Russia out. On September 26, Reuters reported that Belarus has suggested that it may be able to supply nuclear energy to the occupied regions of Ukraine. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko put the idea to Putin when the two met for talks in the Kremlin earlier in September. If a decision is made, we will immediately begin building a new power unit or a new station if there is a need for electricity in Western Russia and in the liberated regions, Lukashenko announced following the meeting. That's helpful to an extent. Putin can use any help he can get when it comes to supplying any sort of power to the occupied regions of Ukraine. However, this offer doesn't do much to help Russia with its gasoline crisis. Putin can't even claim that Belarus's nuclear energy will replace gasoline-derived energy. Russia generates the majority of its electricity using gas and coal, with the rest coming from renewables. Gasoline doesn't even enter the picture, meaning Lukashenko is offering Putin a bunch of oranges when what he really needs is more apples. Again, we come back to the point we made earlier: Belarus may be willing, but it isn't able. No matter how much Putin begs, Belarus can only offer what amounts to a band-aid for the gaping wound that is Russia's gasoline crisis right now. And Belarus isn't going to offer much more than that. Lukashenko is smart enough to know that he can't hurt his own people to serve Putin's needs, whether he wants to or not. Even if the Belarusian president made the terrible decision to sell all of the gasoline his country produces to Russia, that would still only be enough to cover a month or so of Russia's consumption. Putin has to know this, which only goes to show the depths of his desperation. Even the small amount of gasoline Belarus can provide is better than nothing as Russia deals with worsening shortages thanks to Ukraine's strikes. And that leads us to what the future may hold for Russia. It doesn't look good. Russia's refined oil situation isn't going to get any better because Ukraine's strikes are only becoming more frequent and intense. On August 28, Ukraine broke its record for taking Russia's refining offline, Reuters reports. Ukraine's drone strikes took an estimated 3.1 million tons of Russia's refining offline in that month, leading to a total of 6.4 million idle tons when accounting for planned maintenance. That was 65% higher than previous estimates, and Putin would have hoped that it couldn't get any worse from there. It could, and it did. The Kyiv Post says that September's outages were so high that they surpassed the record-breaking August. Breaking things down into daily numbers, September's offline refining exceeded the 206,000 tons per day seen in August. Russia's worst months beyond that also don't come close. May 2022 saw 196,000 tons per day of Russian refining go offline. May 2020 was another past high point, though that was only 164,000 tons per day. Records are being broken, and they're not the kinds of records that Putin wants to see. All of this tells us one thing: Ukraine has found a winning strategy and it's sticking to it. There's absolutely no reason to believe that Ukraine is suddenly going to stop its refinery strikes now that Russia is dealing with a gasoline crisis. It's also hit more than 24 of Russia's major refineries since the beginning of August, the Kyiv Post says. About 70% of the outages reported by these refineries were caused by Ukraine's drones, and Russia doesn't seem to be capable of doing anything about these types of strikes. That's Putin's major problem. Russia has lost 1,224 of its air defense systems since Putin launched his invasion, according to Ukraine's Ministry of Finance. The sheer scale of those losses creates a situation where Russia's domestic defenses are stretched thin. If Putin doesn't move air defenses from inside Russia into Ukraine, then Ukraine can do more damage to his invading forces. But by moving those air defenses, Putin creates gaps that Ukraine can exploit with its long-range drones. Exploit is exactly what it's going to do. Ukraine is already building millions of drones annually. According to the Atlantic Council, Ukraine's current annual total of 5 million could be doubled with Western funding, which would give Ukraine enough drones to completely overwhelm Russia's air defenses. And wouldn't you just know it? On October 1, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, Ursula von der Leyen, announced a new agreement with Ukraine that will see the European Union allocate €2 billion, or around $2.35 billion, to Ukraine for drone production. Europe knows that Ukraine is onto a winning strategy. And with that funding, Ukraine can build even more of the long-range drones that have forced Putin to go to Belarus with the Russian cap in his hands. That's the big reality check for Russia's leader. The crisis he faces right now isn't the endpoint of Ukraine's strategy, it's just the beginning. With more drones being built than ever before, Ukraine's refinery strikes are likely to grow more frequent and powerful. In a few months, 38% of Russia's refining capacity being offline may grow to 50%, maybe more. The Belarusian band-aid is already nowhere near enough to solve the problem. and it will end up being a non-factor if Ukraine simply keeps on doing what it's doing. As Russia grapples with its fuel crisis, Ukraine's deep strikes also impact the country's economy. That's according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, which claims that Ukraine's attacks on Russian territory have cost Putin more than $74 billion since January 2025. That amounts to about 4% of Russia's annual gross domestic product, or GDP. That may not seem like much in percentage terms, but it is a substantial loss for a country that is already grappling with a burgeoning economic crisis. So no, Ukraine's drone strikes aren't going to stop. They're getting too many good results for Ukraine, so Putin can't hang on to any sort of hope that Ukraine is going to relent. The Russian fuel crisis, which is already going to take at least 9 months to fix, is only going to get worse. What we may be seeing here is the slow death of one of the world's energy superpowers in real time. After all, Russia is built on a foundation of oil and gas sales. The Oxford Institute for Energy Studies says that oil and gas revenue accounts for about 20% of Russia's GDP, and up to 50% of its total federal budget revenues during any given year. The more Ukraine attacks Russia's refineries and other energy infrastructure, the more these numbers are going to drop. After all, Russia can't sell a product that it's producing in such limited quantities that it isn't even able to serve its domestic market. Putin's desperate plea to Belarus hasn't gone unheard, but it's a plea that will make no difference given how low Belarus's gasoline output is. Putin has only one way out of this crisis. He has to end the Ukraine war before the Ukraine war ends him. As willing as Belarus seems to be to help Putin out this time around, even if it can't do much, Russia's leader has to be wary of relying too heavily on his ally. Belarus isn't in great shape itself. The country is imploding as Putin's war destroys everything to the point where Russia may not be able to rely on Belarus for much longer. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to Clash of Nations for more coverage of the Russian fuel crisis caused by Ukraine's drone strikes.